Welcome back to Geopolitics Decanted. I'm your host, Dmitri Alperovitch, chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator, a geopolitics think tank in Washington, D.C. And we're back from a short hiatus while I was on a tour for my book with Gary Graff, which if you haven't checked it out already, please do. It's called World on the Brink, How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. It's gotten some really great reviews and is a national bestseller. Very, very proud of it. But today we're back to chatting about Ukraine, and my returning guest is Justin Bronk, Senior Research Fellow for Airpower and Technology in the Military Sciences team at the UK think tank RUSI, and the editor of a new book as well, The Air War in Ukraine, which comes out August 1st this week. And it has some great contributing authors. Our friend Michael Kaufman wrote a chapter, Jack Watling, Guy Plopsky, and others as well. Justin, welcome back to the show, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you, and thanks for having me back.
All right, so we'll get to the book, but I thought it would be a good opportunity to restart our conversation. We began, I think, very early on around the F-16 issue, and we are now approaching the date when those jets might actually get delivered. There's a good post in the Washington Post kind of recapping the situation, that there were about 80 jets in total that have been donated or have been pledged, I should say, by Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and Netherlands. And most of those jets won't come for years, but they should get one squadron this year, and about 6 pilots are getting their training completed this summer. So very, very small numbers, and you're already starting to see some of the spin, I guess you might call it, coming out of Ukraine saying, well, you know, we talked about this being a game changer like so many of the weapons before it, but this won't actually be a game changer in part because of the numbers. You and I have talked about the challenges with the F-16s, the low undercarriage, and the challenge of having pristine runways with it. But, you know, setting that aside, now that they're about to come in, how do you think they might contribute in this fight to Ukraine, particularly in the numbers, small numbers that they're going to get them, to the air defense role, which is presumably how they might be used, at least initially?
Yeah, I think they initially, as you say, the primary use for the relatively small numbers of any initial tranche of F-16 being pushed into country will be for air defense in depth. So a combination of potentially another layer of defenses for intercepting Shahed 136 type one-way attack drones, as well as potentially cruise missiles and even possibly surveillance UAVs. There's a few complicating factors there. I mean, first and foremost, deconfliction with ground-based defenses. Because of the enormous amount of territory that Ukraine has to cover with defenses, there's the bulk of their air defense units by kind of numbers are mobile air defense teams with relatively short range systems, things like Gepard or Shilka, technicals, with so pickup trucks with machine guns, or flatbeds mounted with light anti-aircraft guns, and then man-pads, so man-portable shoulder-fired air defense systems like Stinger, and those are an important part of the Ukrainian air defense layer. Even though each individual team only has a very small coverage area, if that makes sense, the critical challenge of making Ukraine's air defense, particularly ground-based air defense, sustainable, is really being felt at the moment in terms of interceptor ammunition for the bigger systems. And so every cruise missile, every Shahed, every UAV that can be intercepted by those mobile teams with their man-pads, with their AAA, is an interceptor missile that is not being fired at that same target from a much bigger system where the ammunition is much more difficult to source sustainably at scale. With F-16, on the one hand, you could potentially see significant potential capacity over time to augment those layers. On the other hand, particularly anywhere within 150 maybe kilometers of the Russian front line, those F-16s are going to have to be flying at relatively low level, in low altitude, in order to avoid being engaged by long-range Russian surface-to-air missile systems like S-300, V4, S-400. And that will mean that they are flying around in the same airspace that those mobile air defense teams are covering. Obviously, that's already a constraint for Ukraine's existing types, but essentially what I'm getting at is there will be a really significant deconfliction requirement, either with a high reliance on comms.
Can you just ask, is it potentially going to be a little bit easier because, if an F-16 is flying their airspace, they know it's not Russian, whereas with SUs and MiGs, obviously they might be Russian. So is the challenge a little bit easier with the F-16s? They stand out?
It could be a bit easier, certainly in terms of visually aimed systems. If, on the other hand, some of those intercepts are being done at night, a lot of Russia's salvo attacks are done at night to make it more difficult for those mobile air defense teams to engage, particularly small things like Shaheds, then you may not have that visual signature, or at least not hugely clearly, through lower end night vision devices. And also, in bad weather or low cloud, and also just with a very short kind of reaction time, it's amazing how much friendly fire you get in most historical conflicts, even with distinctive types from soldiers on the ground and air defense teams on the ground. None of which is to say that F-16 won't potentially be useful in that ground-based in that augmentation role for the ground-based air defenses for defense in depth. It's just that they won't be able to necessarily range freely all over the place at any time, and they won't necessarily be able to operate in an extremely organic way there because they will need to be deconflicted, either in space in terms of geographical areas or in time, or both, with those ground-based units to prevent fratricide. And that will be a constraint for any Ukrainian Air Force operations. But the other thing to note is that for the internal air defense, against cruise missiles, if they're able to intercept cruise missiles like KH-101 or Kalibir with potentially Sidewinder, A9 ML or X derivatives, then that's a sort of reasonable rate of exchange. And even AMRAAM, that's kind of reasonable. But if you're using...
Reasonable in terms of cost, right? Not having a huge asymmetry.
Yeah, and in terms of the numbers that Russia can sustainably fire versus the numbers of ammunition, versus the quantity of ammunition that can be supplied to Ukraine for use on F-16. But if they're going to be starting to try and use F-16 to engage Shaheds in large numbers, even Sidewinder is pretty expensive to be using that way, particularly later model Sidewinders. And AMRAAM is you're in the same category as those larger ground-based air defense systems in terms of particularly NASAMS, which also uses AMRAAM. So that's not a particularly sustainable way.
And isn't there another problem as well? Because there was some reporting that when Iran launched this massive salvo of Shaheds and ballistic missiles at Israel, that the initial pilots that were in charge of intercepting them tried to use guns and actually radioed back to the other squadrons saying, use missiles, not guns, because it's very dangerous. The thing blows up. Debris can hit you. You can fly through that debris field. So there's also a challenge with using guns and not using missiles on these things, right?
Yeah, especially if you're at low level. The Russia alternates, flying the Shaheds at high level, where they can be relatively easily tracked, but Ukraine has to use higher end systems to engage them, versus flying them at low level where it's more difficult to track them. But so they can do either. But if you're trying to engage something as relatively small as a Shahed or even an observation UAV, you're going to have to get relatively close, and of course the closure speeds are potentially very high for engaging with a gun, unless you're able to really take your time and slow down and kind of close it at a slow pace. You're also potentially going to be worrying about where those rounds are going, because if those Shaheds are flying over Ukrainian territory, then spraying 20mm rounds downwards without taking the time to, as it were, clear your arcs of fire and only engage when they're flying over, say, farmland or non-built up areas. There's additional complexity there, and as you infer, that there's a significant safety risk in terms of shooting these things relatively close, because they do have a up to 40 kilogram warhead on board. If they blow up, then that's a significant amount of shrapnel going at high speed that the aircraft is then potentially going to fly through. And indeed, the Ukrainians have had MiG-29 pilots had to eject after hitting debris from shooting down Shaheds. So this has previously been shown to be a risk for the Ukrainian Air Force. But it will add some capacity. And then, of course, in other potential missions, they'll probably be used in much the same way as the flankers and fulcrums and fences are now, to lob a mix of harm missiles for suppressing air defenses, glide bombs of various kinds, whether it be small diameter bomb, GBU-62, JDAM with a wing kit, and potentially other weapon systems. So one of the good things that F-16 will bring is the option to be able to deliver significantly more complex weapons than GPS-guided glide bombs, where you require more interface between the jet and the aircraft. And so it's where it's been not particularly viable to integrate things on in the way that they've been done so far with MiG-29, Sukhoi 27, Sukhoi 24. F-16 has a lot more flexibility there. The key will be what weapons the US authorizes for use, because any weapon you introduce into theater will inevitably be captured and examined and exploited by the Russian side, who will also pass the information to, and possibly the weapon remnants, to Iran and China, as they have with previous ones. So there is a trade-off to supplying things.
And I haven't seen them comment yet on what types of weapon systems will be provided. Have you seen any public commentary on that?
No, they're being fairly tight-lipped on that. I would suspect it's unlikely that the US will supply the high-end AMRAAMs, so AMRAAM maybe C8 or D3, because those missiles are so central to US and indeed all its allies' air superiority capabilities all over the world. So Russia and by extension China and Iran, North Korea and others getting their hands on ones that fail to self-destruct in one way or another, which will happen if you're using anything in BVR combat over time, would be of serious concern to the US and pretty much all its allies. So I suspect it's likely they'll get slightly older versions of AMRAAM. Ukraine already uses AMRAAM and NASAMS, but that would be inside Ukraine, so much less likely to fall in Russian territory. That will limit the effective range of F-16 in an air-to-air sense. And in any case, even higher-end AMRAAMs are likely to struggle to be effective against Russian glide bomb launchers, which are kind of the key target that people are hoping they'll go after, without an ability to seriously suppress and destroy Russian ground-based air defense coverage in that AO beforehand. Because if they're having to go up to the front lines very, very low to stay under that coverage, pop up only briefly to engage, you'd have to get the timings perfect and have to go right up to the front lines probably, because the missile's starting low and slow in dense air and having to go uphill. AMRAAM was designed to fire high and fast, as high and as fast as you can. So yeah, there'll be some limitations.
So let me get back to the air defense conversation for 1 second. And so we talked about the Shaheds and the challenges there, although, they're mostly dealing with the Shaheds, right, with Gepards and other systems that they've built, incredible acoustic detection system, and they're, as you say, they're low flying and fairly easy to track. The cruise missiles and the ballistic missiles pose the most immediate threat, right? And they don't have enough ground-based air defenses to deal with that. About 50% of their generation capacity has been damaged in recent strikes, presents a huge problem for the winter. They really need to enhance their air defense as soon as possible to try to rebuild it. So, in terms of that role, how successful do you think it will be, at least against the cruise missiles? And, what's the history of using, these types of jets in a cruise missile air defense role?
There isn't a huge amount of combat history. Clearly, the Iranian attack on Israel recently was one of the most obviously relevant examples. But it's worth noting that the aircraft intercepting a lot of those cruise missiles were equipped with large, modern, active electronically scanned array type radars, particularly the US Air Force's Strike Eagles.
And you had a huge distance, right, that they could leverage?
Yeah, and over largely empty desert. So with quite a bit of warning, because those Shaheeds had been fired six-ish hours before impact. And so that actually gave quite a few hours of advance warning that they were probably going to fire cruise missiles and then ballistic missiles even later, to time them to arrive at roughly the same time. The F-16s that will be supplied from Norway, from Denmark, from the Netherlands, these have a much, much smaller, much older mechanically scanned radar, an APG-66, I think V2H. For what it was at the time, it's been modernized to some degree, and it was a capable radar for a lightweight fighter at the time, and they've done what they can with it, but it's not a system that's optimized for picking out low radar cross-section, quite small targets against ground clutter in a potentially heavy electronic warfare environment as well. So yes, the F-16s could be used to bolster cruise missile and Shahed defense, but they're not likely to be shooting down scores of them each evening. This will be an additive capability rather than a transformative capability. And of course, the supply of F-16 will itself create additional draws on and demand signal for ground-based air defense coverage, because there will need to be at least some layer of defense coverage of the bases where they're operating. And one of the key challenges that Ukraine really and its partners really have to solve before F-16 goes in is the current problem of Russian Orlan and potentially other Forpostal Zala series observation drones flying apparently unchecked at medium level significant distances inside Ukraine.
So not just the battlefield, but deep inside Ukraine.
Yeah. So we saw 3 weeks ago now a series of strikes on Ukrainian main air bases by ballistic missiles being directed by Orlan series drones that were just hovering above, and in some cases for a couple hours. That tells you something about the limitations of air defense ammunition currently facing Ukraine. It's not that these UAVs can't be seen, detected, tracked. Particularly, as you mentioned, the passive acoustic sensor net is fantastic at this stage. It's really innovative and really, really effective use of commercial technology by the Ukrainians to put up this sensor web, as it were, have some really clever machine learning enabled processing behind it to track everything from Shaheeds, as initially done, through UAVs, fast jets, cruise missiles, including at low level where radar coverage is difficult to spread across the whole country. So tracking them is sort of already in place. The issue is having interceptors that can sustainably engage those Orlan type observation drones. They fly too high for manpads typically to engage them. And for large-scale systems like NASAMS or RST or even Patriot, they're just far too cheap and numerous to engage sustainably. It's probably one area where the kind of anti-UAV, UAV interceptors are potentially really promising, because
there's been some talk about using FPVs, but again, they can't get up that high, right?
I mean, there's been some success with FPV type things, but I think here, this is where dedicated, relatively low cost, propeller powered missile type UAVs are really, really promising. I mean, we've seen even Western companies looking at some of this stuff. There was the Anduril Coyote, for example, that was being toted around for a while. And, whether these things are reusable or not, the key thing will be having them cost only a couple of tens of thousands of dollars at the most, because Orlans tend to cost the Russians about $60,000 to $90,000, depending on what payload they've got in them and which kind of production lot they came off. So if you're engaging them at significantly cheaper than that, using things that can be built en masse using a combination of 3D printing and relatively commercially available propulsion systems, imaging cameras for terminal guidance, and they're also being used in depth, right? So they're not necessarily needing to be as hardened against EW as systems that you're building for frontline use over Russian lines. That sort of area, I think, really could help, because the detection and tracking is already there. If you have these things in quantity, particularly at things like air bases, power plants, they could pretty easily intercept Orlans and other such things, even if they're not fast enough to engage cruise missiles or anything else, because the trade-off for these relatively small, long endurance, quite long-ranged surveillance UAVs is that they have to fly very slowly in order to get that fuel efficiency and that loiter persistence. So you don't need a missile really to engage them. So yeah, I think that there are answers, but
we've seen some amazing videos of these Yak-52s, these propeller trainer aircraft, right, shooting down some of these drones. Do they need more of those things? They're pretty cheap. I think 100,000 or so.
So the Yak-52 with the shotgun, I mean, I instinctively love it to bits. It sort of speaks to my aviation geek childhood and let's be honest, adulthood. But one of the big limitations there is just, once again, pilots. So yes, there are far more people who can fly a Yak-52 than there are who can fly a fast jet. But you're still, if you were wanting to really scale that up, you're still having to field significant numbers of pilots, maintain a core, run air bases, albeit quite rudimentary ones. So, depending on what the exact cost-benefit trade-off is there, and I don't know the exact numbers, it could be worthwhile. But I think probably the UAV, anti-UAV UAV interceptors is probably the main answer for all-land type surveillance UAVs.
Yeah. One other thing I want to get back to the F-16s conversation and the cruise missiles. Obviously, the distances here are relatively short. If they're launching them just across the border, the flight time is not going to be long. But one of the things that Ukraine does have the benefit of, and if you've been there, as you have and I have, the air defense alarms that you get on your phone and the loudspeakers in places like Kyiv and elsewhere are really tied to mostly launches of MiG and bomber aircraft in Russian territory, which they track very closely. And that's why a lot of these things are false alarms, because they're not necessarily indicating a new strike mission. But, anytime you see one of those, does it make sense to get the aircraft up in the air and be ready to respond and kind of shrink that time of response?
I think you probably have you probably can bring them up to alert status without launching. Apart from anything else, General Siski has already said the F-16s, at least initially, will not be operating closer than 25 miles, 40 kilometers or so from the front lines, just because of the air defense threat and the Russian fighter threat. And from a deconfliction point of view, you'd also expect them probably not to be operating too close to the front lines. So you've got a bit of additional time defending to scramble and intercept cruise missiles and Shaheeds. Clearly, the response time will depend on where the aircraft happens to be when it's launched or prepared for launch, and where the anticipated target routings are. And of course, as we've both seen, when you're in country with the app, let alone the actual Air Force picture, it's not always clear where those missiles are going. As you track them, the potential target list kind of expands and contracts depending on where they go. But one benefit of F-16 compared to obviously ground-based defenses is just transit times can be very short if they need to be, by going to full burner and just motoring around at supersonic. You can cover quite a lot of distance quickly. The trade-off, of course, is very high fuel burn, particularly if you're doing that at low altitude. So endurance will be quite short. Given that Ukraine has experience doing this with MiG-29, where you're facing a lot of the same trade-offs, but almost in a more extreme way, because MiG-29 is a similar internal fuel volume, similar weight. I mean, they're not exactly the same, but roughly similar class. While the MiG-29 has two more thirsty engines to the F-16's one. So, MiG-29 in Russian terms used to be joked as the ideal fighter for gaining air superiority over your own airfield in terms of legs. So the fact that they've managed some intercepts with MiG-29 suggests that the Ukrainians are probably pretty able to run that balance between keeping aircraft on alert, not launching them too soon on false alarms, and still potentially getting to target. But it's certainly not an ideal weapon for that kind of work. It'll be a supplementary capability.
So one thing we haven't talked about is the Storm Shadows and Scalp missiles that right now are integrated in the Su-24s. Do you see a need to integrate them into the F-16s, and would that new launch platform give any benefits over the existing ones?
I mean, the limitation on Su-24 is just numbers of remaining serviceable airframes, right? So F-16 shouldn't, in theory, have a problem with carrying, launching something the size of a Storm Shadow, Scalp. same missile. I suspect
they need to do the integration work, right? Because officially it hasn't been done.
Yeah, the integration work would need to be done, but also this is an area where, as we saw from the integration on Fencer 224 for Ukraine, that work can be done if you're willing to take risk on what the flight software is going to allow you to then do when it's attached as a relatively unknown heavy payload. As long as you don't want significant interface between the missile and the jet. And without going into anything classified, the fact that Storm Shadow or Scalp has proven highly effective despite being used from their Su-24, where there will be very limited to no ability to pass data to the missile from the aircraft's own systems, suggests that the missile probably isn't terribly dependent on data from the aircraft to be effective.
They pre-program it in advance, basically, is what you're saying, right?
One could certainly infer that fairly logically.
Yeah.
It isn't integrated on F-16, and I think as long as the Fencers continue to fly, that will probably remain the preferred launch platform, just also by dint of the fact that the pilots are now pretty experienced at those deliveries and the intricacies of how that has to be done. And there'll be quite a lot of demands on the few F-16s that are initially there anyway for air defense and delivery of things like JDAM and HARM and SDB. So, yeah, as a potential fallback option, maybe at some point I suspect that might be looked at, but I don't think it'll be a priority up front.
So you don't see any benefits, particularly sort of in the Black Sea missions targeting the Black Sea Fleet or the targets in Crimea, of using an F-16 over Su-24?
Well, F-16 can take Harpoon, theoretically. Now, whether you would want to potentially risk F-16 going after what is at this point a very ineffective Russian Black Sea fleet, it's pretty muted, it is a different question. And in terms of the interface between the aircraft and the weapon, I don't know if Harpoon has ever been integrated on those F-16s, and there are significant differences between different blocks and different mission computer fits of different F-16s, so it may or may not be particularly easy. But also there's a question of will that be a priority? The key thing that Ukraine, I think, would really want in the Black Sea at this point is an anti-submarine capability to go after the kilos. Because that's really the only thing that Russia now sustainably operates in the Western Black Sea.
And they still present a huge missile threat.
Right. So, but I don't think F-16 has many obvious answers in that domain. I think that's probably more likely to be something that would have to be gone after in other ways, like with uncrewed maritime systems of various kinds.
So you were one of the first ones that have raised the issue of Gripens and how they're much better aircraft for Ukraine than the F-16s. Now, we're moving forward with the F-16s. That's a done deal. But the Gripen issue is still outstanding. And, I've had conversations with senior officials in Sweden throughout the course of the war. And they've been pretty open to providing the Gripens once they join NATO. Obviously, now they're now in NATO. They do have the numbers issues. There aren't a lot of those aircraft available. But they see the benefits of demonstrating their capabilities because they haven't been able to export a whole lot of them in the last decade or so, in part because of the attractions of the F-16s in the export market. Yeah. But, there's been sort of rumors that the U.S. doesn't want the Gripens to get out there, at least until the F-16 training is done, so that you're not training them on both aircraft. But let's assume or at some point the Gripens will come into play over the next year or so. How do you think that would change things? And again, assuming that they'll come in relatively small numbers. Would small numbers of Gripens really make a difference?
I think small numbers of Gripens really could make a difference. And the kind of core argument, both among Ukrainian Air Force and Ukrainian military folk and the US and other NATO allies who are working on F-16 is not that the Gripen wouldn't be a more suitable platform. Everyone kind of agrees on that. And indeed, the Ukrainians came to that conclusion themselves between 2014 and 2022. Just couldn't get the politics and the money and everything kind of in place to make an acquisition go through at the time. So from a capability point of view, it's so obvious that That's not really disputed by any side at this stage. The core question would be whether Meteor would be supplied. So,
although I will tell you this, having had a lot of conversations with senior Ukrainian officials, while on the technical level they appreciate the benefits of Gripen, on the political level, the attractiveness of F-16 and touting that the receipt of those planes was a big deal for Zelensky and the political team, and also just the sustainability of being on a major NATO platform for many years to come. The real benefits to that from their perspective.
I would say I recognize all of that. I would say that most of the people who hold that view know nothing about fighter planes.
That is definitely true.
And it's not to denigrate that view, genuinely. And there's a reason why lots and lots of countries around the world who don't necessarily have particularly high-end combat air requirements select and buy F-35s. Like, F-35 is an obvious choice for countries that need to operate in highly contested airspace. So like Finland buying it, for example, well, yeah, because half their air bases are within an S-300 V4 and S-400 MES, and they're right on the doorstep with the Russians. So obviously they would go for the thing designed to operate in those environments efficiently. Whereas if you look at countries like Switzerland, that it's hard really to define what their Air Force requirements are beyond quick reaction alert. And they used to struggle to do that 24/7, 365, even with Hornet and F-5. Them going for F-35, that's clearly a political choice. So big P politics is always going to be a significant factor in choice of aircraft. So it really isn't to denigrate that viewpoint. And from the point of view of the Zelensky administration and large parts of the Ukrainian general staff, particularly those of a army bent or ground-based air defense bent who don't necessarily have that background in really understanding fighter aircraft, the metric is pretty clear. I mean, this is the aircraft, the F-16 is the aircraft that's got the most numbers available. It's most likely to be supplied, and it creates a link with the US, which obviously the US is the indispensable security partner for Ukraine's continued defense and viability of defense. So I highly buy all of those arguments. The issue will be that the perception that it's easier to support in country because of that bigger pool, I think is likely to be sadly misplaced. Because of the fact that the F-16 really isn't designed to be operated in that kind of context. It was designed for a US Air Force that had pretty uncontested bases that were enormous and extremely well maintained, with the ability to have huge amounts of ground support staff and ground-based support equipment. And that's not the case in Ukraine, whereas Gripen was designed to be maintained by teams of conscripts with one supervisor on light vehicles in dispersed air bases while fighting the Russians under a combined SAM and fighter threat that outnumbered you while not being in NATO. It's pretty easy to see why from a capability point of view.
Wow, that situation sounds familiar.
Well, exactly. And it's also cheaper to operate the Gripen. And it's got a more capable radar than the F-16 versions that are going, and it's compatible with Meteor, which there is a question mark. I think if Gripen was supplied without Meteor, just with AMRAAM and Sidewinder or RST or whatever, then I think I probably would agree potentially with the viewpoint of a lot of people in the current F-16 effort that it's just not worth the additional distraction and capacity drain of trying to do two fighters at once, and therefore everything should concentrate on F-16 first and then look at F-16 at Gripen potentially later. If it was supplied with the Meteor missile that has that ramjet propulsion, that assuming you can get it up to speed initially, that's not entirely a given in every context, but working within the way the weapon's designed to operate, it gives you a far greater effective range against a relatively high-flying fighter-type target. And therefore, even a small number of Gripens could potentially pose a serious risk to Russian glide bomb sorties and fighter caps without having to go very close to the front lines. Certainly not nearly as close or over it as AMRAAM would require off either a Gripen or an F-16. And therefore would be able to have that air defense effect. Even after just a couple of engagements, the Russians tend to back off when they don't have an answer to losses from sufficiently far back that you also wouldn't need large, complex four-ship or larger formation tactics to suppress your way into the front lines in order to have that effect. because you could launch from much further back with a much greater chance of success, you could have much simpler tactics with smaller formations, not needing to go so close. And therefore, the pilot training would be easier. The logistics of mounting sorties to try and go after Russian jets would be much easier. You'd need fewer aircraft. And yeah. So there's a lot going for it. And I think, especially given the numbers that are floating around on F-16 pilots trained currently, it really does, I think, give the lie to the line that has been pushed at Gripen for a long time by opponents of that concept, saying, well, but there aren't enough of them. There's far more potentially available than there are Ukrainian pilots ready to fly them, or who could be relatively quickly converted, or could be supported in country in any sort of for the foreseeable. So, yes, at some point Ukraine wants a force of several hundred fighter aircraft, but that is a mid to long term project. And right now the key is to bolster their air defense and, if possible, get a system in country that can push those glide bombers back out of range. And the only thing fighter-wise that I can see that could conceivably do that is Gripen. Hence the push for, even if it were only a small number, getting them in country as soon as possible.
Well, you heard it here first. Let's get the Gripens in there. Let's switch to the book. And I'll admit I haven't had a chance to get my hands on a copy yet. Very much looking forward to it. But this is about the first year of the air war, right? And we've had a podcast back, probably 2 years ago now, on some of the lessons learned there. What are the other big takeaways that your contributing authors have identified from that, looking back at that time period?
Yeah, I think the main things that a lot of those fantastic contributors like Mike Hoffman, Sean Biswasser, Sam Bendit, others have pushed in, is to really put the air war and the analysis of the air war itself into the context of the wider Russian invasion and into the context of Russia's non-military stuff as well. So, for example, there's a fantastic chapter looking at essentially Russian special services operations, their role in that kind of hybrid war plan for Ukraine, and in terms of setting the Russian sort of security oligarchies' expectations of the war, which is crucial to understanding why air power was employed the way it was at the start of the war, just as much as understanding the technical limitations and strengths of the Russian aircraft, how they were used, the weapons, how the ground-based air defenses were done, which are all dealt with. But the key thing I think that hopefully will set this book apart slightly is having that context front and center of, this is the context in which air power was being used in the Russian invasion as a whole. This is how the Russian security leadership had thought about this from a doctrinal point of view, from a security outcomes point of view, and therefore this is what the invasion was intended to achieve. This is what effects they thought military power needed to achieve. And then you go into the long-range precision fires campaign, which of course has been one of the most enduring and effective bits of Russian air operations, unfortunately. The Hostomel insertion and kind of air assault operations in general, the takeaways from that often overlooked helicopter assault and the use of helicopter troops in general in the war, in the first year at least. And then looking at we look at the Russian air operations specifically from the SEAD lens. So because Russian air operations largely petered out over Ukrainian territory within a week and a half, except for some nighttime and occasional daylight bombing runs with short penetration distances, particularly near Mariupol and Kharkiv. But that was because of the failure to conduct SEAD. And so that then became...
And SEAD, for our audience, is suppression of enemy air defenses.
Right. And so that chapter with Guy Plopsky and myself looks at, first of all, kind of what capabilities the VKS had in the SEAD domain, how they used them, and goes through as many kind of examples of tactical vignettes and things throughout the first year of the war that we were able to pull from Russian sources. And so looking at not only the initial success of SEAD and then the failure at DEED and sustaining SEAD from the VKS, but then also how that adapted throughout the first year with the changing use of anti-radiation missiles, combined fighter caps, that kind of thing.
So how would you say the Russians have adapted, sort of looking at more recent times? What are the major adaptations on their part? You've seen the glide bombs obviously being used at the front with devastating effect. where else have they realized that air power can be more useful than it was in the first year?
Well, their use of long-range strike has evolved significantly, and with almost a 2 to 3 month kind of evolution cycle as they experiment with new tactics, obviously new weapons with the introduction of the Shahed. They've evolved some of their existing weapons, putting countermeasures, for example, on KH-101, bringing a lot more use of the Kinjal aero ballistic missile into play. And essentially what you've seen there is a kind of cat and mouse back and forth of, as Ukraine very successfully has in multiple cases adapted its ground-based air defense coverage to each new iteration of Russian strike capabilities, the Russians have kind of shown a very strong and unfortunately consistent capacity to observe how the defenses are reacting, how they're being more effective, and then change their strike patterns. So you've seen changes in salvo size, salvo frequency, altitude of various things, the mixing of different capabilities in terms of high altitude, low altitude, the use of pathfinding, so sending in a couple of, for example, unarmed Shaheds with data links to essentially be pathfinders to identify and report back where Ukrainian air defense coverage is encountered, so they can last minute modify the route for the subsequent salvo. And playing around with various iterations of kind of methodology of mission planning in terms of route planning and timings for various salvos of different kinds. So it's also oscillated a bit between attempting to penetrate better in individual attacks and going through phases of apparently just trying to saturate Ukrainian defenses and exhaust ammunition. So yeah, it's a very dynamic back and forth that we've seen over the last couple of years. And as you alluded to earlier in our chat, in the last 6 months, Russia has unfortunately really increased its effectiveness at targeting Ukrainian infrastructure, and that's both a feature of multiple competing constraints on the Ukrainian side, some doctrinal shifts on the Ukrainian side, and just shortages of air defense ammunition in critical areas. So there's an element of, particularly with these big things like power stations, the Ukrainians have to be lucky every time, whereas the Russians only have to be lucky once to get a really devastating strike through.
And how would you say the Western, particularly medium-range air defenses like Patriots, NASAMS, have performed and are performing now? It seems like they've really had incredible success rates, particularly early on, maybe a little bit less so now. How would you characterize things as they stand today?
So at a technical level, the Western systems have generally worked extremely well, including performing very well against Kinjal, where there wasn't 100% certainty that they, just because the data was not complete on realistic testing there in some aspects of that intercept profile. So the fact that at a technical level, Patriot in particular has worked extremely well is pretty beyond doubt, and it's not only worked very well in the missile defense role, but they've had a number of successes with long-range SAM ambushes, moving Patriot tells transporter erector launchers pretty close to the front lines and radars somewhat close, and engaging the Russian fighter caps and anti-radiation missile launching sorties and Su-34 strike sorties.
Even apparently the A-50, right?
Yeah. Although there's
some debate about that, right?
Debate about the effector. So in one case at least, the engagement is really too far for a Patriot. So it would suggest that the Ukrainian claims to have modified an S-200, or an SA-5 as we'd call it, to use the returns from a much more modern radar, essentially Patriot, would seem to be the more credible explanation there in the absence of other information. That must have been a heck of a modification, because the S-200 has a very long kinematic range. It's a big old missile. It looks like something out of the Thunderbirds, but basically it was a system that was very, very susceptible to electronic warfare jamming. And so given how good the Russians are at EW, particularly in that bit of the kind of Eastern Black Sea, they must have seen some significant modifications there, if that's the way that it was done.
Or got lucky, right? Sometimes this stuff is just turned off.
Sometimes, but the fact that they managed to engage and down an A-50 and at the same time damage an Ilyushin 22 and then repeat the feat against both an A-50, another A-50 and a backfire in the subsequent month or two suggests that, especially given that there aren't a huge number of these interceptors, and every time if you're moving things close to the front line, it's a significant risk.
Backfires a Tupolev bomber.
Yeah, Tu-22 M3 bombers, which have been used for some of the most atrocious attacks on civilian targets because typically they fire obsolescent or obsolete KH, or sometimes Russians call them X, 22 or 32, which are sort of supersonic quasi-ballistic anti-ship missiles. They're really not particularly accurate in a land attack role, but they carry a huge 1.5-ton warhead, and they're the weapons that have been used in some of the worst mass casualty attacks on civilians, so hitting shopping centers and tower blocks, because the Russians don't really care that they're not likely to hit anything military. They have a lot of these old missiles. They would otherwise just have to dispose of them, and so they've been using the Tu-22 backfires to fire them into Ukraine for a long time now. So yeah, impressive that Ukraine managed to shoot one down, which was, there was footage of it spiraling down in a flat spin on fire quite deep inside Russia. So again, not disputed as a loss.
All right, last question, sort of stepping back from the Ukraine conflict and looking at broader changes to doctrine and particularly the integrations of UAVs into U.S. and other allied air forces. This concept of loyal wingman, as it's called in some places, is coming up more and more frequently, that you're going to use manned aircraft, manned fighters with unmanned combat vehicles that they can control or use as sensing, what have you. Where do you see this going, particularly in the next 10, 15 years? How should we be thinking about the future of air combat between advanced nations? Now, a big question.
Yeah, it's a big question. I think the key thing that will probably dictate how a lot of these cooperative combat aircraft, additive combat platforms, however you want, autonomous combat platforms, however you want to define them, or loyal wingmen, the key relationship that will determine the shape they take and how successful they are will be how you balance the justification for their existence in many ways, that they're supposed to create cheap mass, with the fact that if they're, particularly in the Indo-Pacific where the ranges are huge, if they're needing to go to the same operational areas as combat aircraft, which almost by definition they would need to, then either they're being launched from the same sort of distances that the combat aircraft are, and in which case they'll have to be really quite big, because unless they're going to travel incredibly slowly, like an Orlan or a Shahed, relative to a fast jet, in which case they'll be pretty easy to shoot down potentially, but also
it won't be much of a wingman then, right?
Exactly. It'll essentially be a decoy, or some sort of smart decoy. If you want them to accompany the fast jets, then they're going to have a similar aerodynamic performance, at least to some degree, and a similar range, which in the Indo-Pacific in particular pushes you into things that are roughly the size of a light trainer, like a Hawk or a T-38, in terms of weight class at least. Because if you want something to go many hundreds of miles, particularly if you want it to come back, so it has to go double the distance with a fuel margin, and you want it to go at reasonably high speeds, it's going to have to be jet powered, and it's going to have to carry quite a lot of fuel. And if you make them much slower than the fast jets, even if they're subsonic, but they would still need to be high subsonic, because otherwise you're tethering your fast jets to things that are much, much slower, or you're creating very complex mission coordination requirements. And again, then they're really not wingman type capabilities. But if you make them as fast and as maneuverable, and well, not necessarily maneuverable, but as fast as fast jets with the range, then you're really pushing power requirements and engine requirements that again push fuel burn requirements that keep making these things bigger. So there's a really difficult iron trade-off space there. Whereas if you're not having them go the whole way, if they're essentially expendable, they're coming off a rail or the back of a cargo plane type thing, then you can get around some of those problems. But for a start, you're then trading rail space on a limited number of combat aircraft that you can project forward into heavily defended areas, which will be at the end of a long chain of tankers. And so the number of sorties that you can effectively generate and sustain in the frontline area, particularly again in the Indo-Pacific, will be quite limited. So if you're taking payload and rail space off those what would be weapons or fuel tanks, off those aircraft, for them to carry expendable type UAVs, then those UAVs that you're carrying don't just have to be theoretically useful. They have to be more useful than carrying weapons and advanced decoys, things like MoldX, which are already highly intelligent, essentially stand-in electronic warfare platforms. They just look like a cruise missile.
And the cost goes up significantly.
Right. And in order to be more useful than carrying an existing cruise missile, long-range air-to-air missile, whatever it has to be, the sensors and effectors that you need to put in that, whatever that CCA type airframe is, need to be pretty high-end. And you need data links and other things. Like even a data link on its own is about $40,000. So very quickly you end up in a space where even if you make the weapon low performance and cheap in terms of its airframe, relatively speaking, although it's still going to have to be engineered to withstand the strain of being carried around by a fighter jet, which is non-trivial, and the integration costs and separation testing and all of that stuff. But it also then, you're in an area where the sensors and the effector are so expensive that arguably you really want it back. So you do want it to be semi-survivable. Either it's expendable, in which case you fire it, you lose it. You're really talking about smart weapons at that point. You probably need to be below a couple of $1 million, which really limits how much sophistication you can put in these things for the ranges and speeds that you need to work with fast jets. Or you want it to be survivable, i.e. you don't mind as much if you lose it compared to a fast jet with a person in it, but you do want it back, which means you either need it to be able to self-recover, i.e. land, which adds more range, landing gear, significant complexity in terms of being safe coming into an airfield and all of that, and therefore cost and size. Or you do a parachute type recovery or something similar. But then you need an entire new ecosystem of people and equipment to go and locate these things, secure them, recover them, inspect them, repair them if needed, recertify them as safe, and transport them back to the base for the next sortie. And that requires lots of people. It's never been costed. It's again, it's going to be difficult, I think, to get these things in that attritable space to do all of this stuff and be more useful than just spending the same amount of additional money that you would spend on CCAs on buying more of the weapons we have. In the vast majority of cases, especially in Europe, against the Russians, the problem is not that our weapons aren't suitable. The problem is we don't have nearly enough of them.
Right.
And so just repeating the mantra that if we make it uncrewed and AI powered, somehow it will add mass. It
has to be orders of magnitude cheaper.
Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be orders of magnitude cheaper per se, but it has to be cheaper for the effect you gain than just spending it on buying more of the types of weapons, decoys, and effectors that we already have. And for the most part, given all of the additional costs, maintenance, ecosystem, everything, testing, integration that you would need, it's normally just going to be more bang for your buck to buy more of the stuff we already have that works, but we don't have enough of. Indo-Pacific, slightly different, but then the requirements there to fill gaps that currently exist with things like hypersonic weapons or very long-range air-to-air missiles are so technically demanding that you're already in the space where the weapons alone cost vast amounts of money. And getting an uncrewed system to do that is tricky. I think the future of uncrewed systems for now, or for the immediate future, is in things that are in the probably $20 to $40 million per tail area that are survivable and reusable. But as has been mentioned as a target for CCAs in the USAF, about a third to a half the cost of a fast jet. But you don't have to fly them nearly as much because you don't have to gain and maintain pilot currency with them. So about 90% of the flying you would do with a fast jet fleet of a similar size, you won't have to do. You can therefore design them to be much cheaper to own because they won't have to have nearly such a long fatigue life. You won't have to fly them all the time. You don't have to have an operational conversion unit, lots of squadron or 2 or 3 squadrons on a cycle for each one that's ready to deploy and use, because you can just have the things and fly them once in a while to make sure the gaskets don't dry out. But beyond that, you really don't need to fly them very often. And most of your force can be your front line that's ready. And I think they'll mostly be used not as wingman type things, but as standalone capabilities. So either penetrating ISTAR, intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition, reconnaissance. So going into really heavily defended areas and finding time-sensitive targets and passing that data back to crewed platforms, or possibly kind of high-end systems for hunting high-value assets like AWACS, tankers, or strike assets for doing things like suppression of enemy air defenses, because there the autonomy you need doesn't even need to be AI. For really high-end missions like that, where you're going after things that have a very specific signature, combatancy is not subjective, really. Civilians don't operate fire control radars. Civilians don't fly supersonic aircraft. Civilians don't emit on a giant AWACS array. For those really high-end mission sets, I think the autonomy is much easier to do, and you can generate really potentially very efficient fleets, but they're still going to be quite expensive per airframe because they're going to need to be survivable and reusable, and therefore stealthy and quite complex.
There's always trade-offs. Justin Bronk, always fascinating conversations. The book is The Air War in Ukraine, the First Year of Conflict. Check it out. And thanks so much for coming back.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Dmitri.